Hello and welcome to the Franz Van Kat interview. I'm Annette Young. It's been more than 14 months since British politician David Miliband narrowly lost the Labor leadership election to his brother Ed. In the interest of filial loyalty and party unity, the former Foreign Secretary shied away from taking a post in the shadow cabinet. But in recent months, he's begun to re-emerge into the limelight, most notably publicly questioning the finer points of British foreign policy, such as the impact of the Arab Spring and Britain's role in Afghanistan. David Miliband joins me today from London. David Miliband, thank you so much for joining us. Let me start by just talking to you about the Eurozone crisis and the G20 summit. It seems Britain is fighting hard to have its voice heard in order to speed up a resolution as such. Is there a danger, however, that the public sentiment in Britain might pressure the government to in fact walk away as opposed to getting more involved?
Hello, Annette. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think that there are two challenges for Mr. Cameron as he approaches the summit and the further discussions. The first is that he's in danger of using a high-handed tone or an arrogant tone, which annoys other European leaders. I think President Sarkozy made that clear about 10 days ago. Secondly, and probably more importantly, David Cameron's priority is to pacify some of his own backbenchers, maybe some of his own thinking, and he's advancing an agenda for repatriating some powers of the European Union to Britain. That seems to me to be not the main issue at the moment, when the Eurozone is in crisis, when the European budgetary talks are coming up, starting quite soon, for a new financial perspective starting in 2013. The danger is that Britain's voice is not as loud and as clear as it should be for a Europe that is looking outwards, for a Europe that is reforming its own economies, while respecting the right of Eurozone members to make their own decisions, but nonetheless urging them to grasp the various nettles that are in front of them.
So what do you think of the way that he is indeed handling the crisis?
Well, obviously Britain is not in the euro. The Labour government felt that there hadn't been sufficient convergence between the British economy and the eurozone economies by the time it made its assessment 5 or 6 years ago. I think that was the right decision. And so obviously, at one level, David Cameron is not the main player or one of the main players in this. I think his Chancellor, George Osborne, has been making some sensible noises about the kind of changes that are going to be needed in Eurozone governance and the sort of fiscal coordination that takes place within the European Union. The notion of a Greek default seems to me to have been inevitable for at least a year, and I think there's a real question mark about why this, whether or not it's now too late, because you'll have heard the reports, read the reports that I have of growing panic in Athens, of growing challenges to the Greek government. The historians will look back and I think say that if measures had been taken earlier, we wouldn't be in this situation now. As far as David Cameron is concerned, I think other than breathing a sigh of relief that he's not actually in the euro, he'll be hoping that the Eurozone leaders do show the necessary decisiveness at this very difficult time.
Now, as I said earlier, recently, after a notable absence, David Miliband, you've started to talk rather publicly about various foreign policy issues. For instance, you recently wrote an opinion piece after a visit to Gaza in which you questioned Israel's economic blockade of the Palestinian coastal strip. You actually said, in your own words, that it was actually irrational. What needs to be done, in your opinion?
Well, I proposed and negotiated the ceasefire resolution for the Gaza war in January 2009, UN Security Council resolution, to bring the Gaza war to an end. It promised to open up the supply of goods into Gaza and to curtail the flow of arms into Gaza. Neither of those things has happened. I think the Israeli blockade is a significant part of the problem. And the reason it's irrational is that goods do go into Gaza, but not through the legal route of the Erez or other crossings. They go through the some 200 tunnels that join Gaza with Egypt, tunnels that are big enough to import cars, never mind guns. So there is a profound irrationality there. I think it's very dangerous if Gaza becomes a forgotten part of the Israel-Palestine, Israel-Arab conflict, because Gaza has shown its ability in the past, notably in 2008-9, to blow up and scupper any hopes of political progress. I went there with Save the Children Fund, which is an international children's charity, not to make political meetings or to have political meetings, but to see some of the conditions facing especially mothers and children. And while the situation in Gaza is not one of the most extreme hunger or even starvation, it is one of extreme oppression and of a siege mentality, and that isn't good for the kind of political developments, never mind economic developments, that are going to be necessary for Palestine and Israel to learn to live together.
But have your views changed since you were Foreign Secretary, or are you just simply nowadays freer to say publicly what it is you actually believe?
Well, I spoke up pretty clearly about Gaza in the past. I've always said that a quote-unquote Gaza last policy, in which there is a settlement between Palestinians in the West Bank and leaving out Gaza and Israel, is not going to work. But President Abbas is the nominated head of all of the Palestinian people, whether they live in Gaza or the West Bank, and he needs to be able to negotiate for both of them. I was never able to visit Gaza as foreign minister because of security problems, so I was able to see for myself the tragedy of that part of the world.
Did your views change, though, as a result of actually physically being present?
I think, of course, you can read about what it means to live in a tiny strip of land and have great difficulty in getting out. But to meet children who are able to go to school for 2 or 3 hours a day because they're on a shift system where their school has to take 2 or 3 shifts of pupils, and so they only each get 2 or 3 hours of education a day, shows you some of the difficulties. And I think it's a shift of perspective that is engendered by that sort of visit.
Do you believe that the Palestinians' current campaign to obtain statehood via the United Nations is actually going to achieve anything at the end of the day?
Well, I think it's smart tactics. I think the great danger for President Abbas and the Palestinians at the beginning of 2011 was that in the wake of the Arab Spring, the Palestinian issue would simply fall off the agenda. And so it's been good tactics to go to the UN. I think that it's good tactics also to take their push to UNESCO. Despite the American legislation that will, it seems, curtail some American funding, I think it's vital, if you believe in a political track to a Palestinian state, a negotiated track, it needs to remain on the political agenda. Now, they've also got to make sure that they've got smart strategy as well as smart tactics. And the only way the Palestinians will ever get a state is through negotiations. It's important that while they pursue their UN ambitions, they explore every avenue and take every opportunity to engage the Israelis in any kind of peace discussions. The Quartet have set a short timetable for each side to come forward with proposals. I think it's very important on borders. I think it's very important that both sides do.
Now, you were also in Egypt recently, where you were meeting young people. Are you worried that the path to democratic transition is slowing down to the point that we might not see presidential elections for some time?
Well, there is concern, including amongst people who study this very carefully, but also on my part, that the deeper the military get into running the country, the Supreme Council of the of the Armed Forces has been running the country since President Mubarak's deposition, that the deeper they get into running the country, the harder they're going to find to release the reins of power. When I was in Egypt two weeks ago, people were talking about presidential elections being delayed even into 2013. I think that would be very damaging. Egypt needs a civilian government accountable for defending a new constitution as soon as possible. And people say that they're worried about the imbalance in organisation between parties associated with the Muslim Brotherhood and other parties that weren't able to develop in the Mubarak years. I understand that. But the best path to democratic development is one that embraces the opportunities of democracy. And I think that my own view is that the minorities in Egypt, for example, the Christian Copts, are going to be best defended by a government that is elected as a civilian government that is elected by its own people, rather than by a military authority whose ability to handle delicate political situations, I think, is very open to question.
Now, turning to Afghanistan, Britain currently has around 9,500 troops in the country, but Prime Minister Cameron has given assurances that level will only remain up until the end of the year. However, violence is very much on the up. Is this the time to be talking to the Taliban, David Miliband?
Yes, it is, but it's important not just to talk to the Taliban. Look, the great danger in Afghanistan is of a civil war, of a restart of the civil war. So around the table, in fact, two tables need to be, first of all of the internal players, the Taliban, but also various aspects of the Northern Alliance, Uzbeks, Tajiks, not just Pashtuns. So there's an internal discussion within Afghanistan. There also needs to be a second table, a regional table, with all of the regional players, notably Pakistan, but also China, India, all the way round to Iran. And it seems to me those two processes have to run in parallel. I think Secretary Clinton's recent remarks in her testimony to the House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs were significant in this regard and important. The only way to bring Afghanistan any kind of stability is for a political settlement in which all the tribes are inside the tent, Al-Qaeda is kept out, and the neighbours, the neighbouring countries, are on side. And I think it's vital that this political drive is given much, much greater momentum than it has at the moment.
Finally, David Miliband, what about your future plans? Are we going to see you taking a more prominent role in British politics?
Well, I think that it's very important that my brother, who's leading the Labour Party, has the full space to lead the party as he sees fit. I've chosen not to be in the front line because I don't want to be part of a political
Are you missing it, though?
Soap opera.
Are you missing it?
Well, I miss, above all, being in government because opposition is pure frustration and futility. But of course I miss the front line of politics, but I think sometimes one has to do the right thing even if it's frustrating. And after you've lost 2 elections in 1 year, which I managed in 2010, I think a period of humility is probably appropriate.
David Miliband, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. That's it for this edition of the Franz Van Cat interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up shortly.